This is the Page Publishing Book Club. How you doing? How's everything going? Is spring by you yet? Kind of had a late spring around here. But things are better now. I am your host, Alice Stockton Rossini. Rob Barretts is my engineer. Can you feel the world changing into a world like that you don't even recognize anymore? That's how David Stein feels. He grew up riding horses and herding cattle in northern Minnesota, became a physicist and entrepreneur, spent 50 years in the computer industry. He has seen the transformation of America over the last 80 years or so, and felt compelled for the sake of his children and his grandchildren to write Draining the Swamp.
It's really about the evolution of our country in socio-political terms over the last 100 years. And that's because it has changed so much. To me, it's like night and day, the difference. And yet my own children are unaware of it. So I have to believe that the vast majority of people in this country have no concept of what this country was really like, even 50 years ago, not to mention 100. And I tried to answer two questions, really. And the first one is, how did the country get to the current point, which is not a good one. We have a basic constitutional crisis on a daily basis, and we've got political parties at each other's throats, and we are not doing as well economically as we are capable of doing. And there's just a great malaise in the country. And so the first question is, how did this happen? And the second question is, what can we do about it?
Do you have suggestions?
Yes, a number of suggestions. And it begins with a requirement for some constitutional amendments, because the founders of the country could not have known what was going to be happening 100 years hence, let alone 200 or 300. And consequently, they couldn't anticipate things like labor unions, the international communist movement. And so the Constitution is an imperfect document. It's a work in progress. And they knew that. And that's why they provided a process for amending it. However, it hasn't been amended in many years. And there are some very critical amendments that are needed. So I have 12 recommended amendments in my book. And that's not sufficient by itself. There need to be some additional changes. For example, at the outset of World War I, this country was torn with indecision because the country wanted to be isolationist, and many of the citizens were of German origin. German was almost the official language of the United States at the beginning. But World War I brought that to the fore, and there were a lot of people that didn't want to fight Germany. And so there were real concerns about how do you prevent, open sedition in this country. And so there was an act of Congress passed called the Sedition Act of 1918, which we could really benefit from today. For example, there were criminal penalties for denying people's right of free speech. If we had those penalties today, we could lock up half the faculties on our American campuses, because they do not allow free speech on their campus. This is one of the reasons this country's in so much trouble. It has lost its bearings and is adrift in this sea of what I call socio-communism, which is going to bring us down if we don't do something about it.
All right, David, and there's more where that came from in 78 pages. Yes, this book is just 78 pages. David zeroes in on what he thinks this country needs to do to survive. Patricia Graves had an experience that bothered her for years, and the title of her book tells you how frustrated she was by what she witnessed as an employee for a state mental health services department. The name of her book, Murder is Against the Law, but pretty strong words, Patricia. What happened?
A child was placed in my building, and the child was making all these assaults against the other patients, and they were really bad assaults, and we couldn't get rid of the child. And myself and a union representative happened to walk into the office and found my boss and a police officer abusing and assaulting the child. Oh. So I automatically became a witness, and I was subpoenaed by the state, and I was subpoenaed by the union. The union is trying to get the terminated employees back. The state is trying to say I saw nothing.
So the state wants you to lie.
Right. When I met with the CEO, they called me down in a meeting, and they gave me a list of questions that I was going to be asked, and they gave me a list of answers. And it was a mess. But, when everything came down, and it's like the union rep is kind of blackmailing me because she's seeing the same thing that I seen. And she's saying, if you don't tell it, I'm going to tell what you saw. And when we went to court, I told the truth. And when I got back to work the following day, I had been demoted with no charges, no disciplinary actions. And this demotions went on down 3 different levels. I got demoted 3 times. So I've got the CEO, the assistant CEO, the human resources officer, the employee relations officer, and several unit directors doing all kinds of things to get me fired.
Well, it says here in the description of what your book's about that when things take a turn for the worst, your character decides to take matters into her own hands, wreaking revenge on all those who have wronged her.
Right.
She knows murder
Right.
is against the law, but some people need to die. So you didn't really kill anybody, right?
No, nobody actually dies because, like the title implies, this woman knows that murder is against the law, but what can she do? She uses her imagination. Like with the case with the director who's doing the sexual harassment,
Right.
he in turn turned around and filed a case against her, said she was sexually harassing him. So what the character in the book does is she gets a mask made of herself, of her face, and she hires a prostitute who goes into the office and seduces him. And she's at the window taking pictures. And she ends up pasting these pictures all over the entire institution, correct, which forces him to resign. So what it is with the character in the book, she has no witness to prove that he's been doing the things that he's been doing. But he has the power to prove and to get her moved.
Right.
So she has to get to him, but how? And she gets through him, through his penis.
There you go.
Because that's what he wanted.
You must have felt so good when you finished this book.
These incidences occurred between 2003 to 2005. And I was a torn, depressed wreck. Always in fear, always just scared, just going to work. People I've known for 20, 25 years wouldn't even talk to me because somebody might see them talking to me and they get in trouble. They wanted me alone, and that's where they had me. And I'm in a state of mind, and on one instance they told me that I was a danger to myself and others, so I have to go and sign myself into a mental health program for 6 weeks or be fired. So these are the types of things that they were doing, So I went into the program because I had to keep my job, but these are the types of things that I was going through, and I was seeing psychiatrists for years. He said, write a book. Write a book. I said, yeah, write a book. And that's when I started writing this thing. 5 or 6 months, and it was done. Because all of this that was trapped in my head was just flowing. It was just flowing, and my hands are trying to keep up with my thoughts while I'm typing. And it was just rolling and just rolling and rolling and rolling. And suddenly it was done. And when I held the first published copy in my hand, my feelings were everything that happened, all of the fear, the hate, the confusion, the desire for revenge, everything was within those pages, and I was holding it in my hands. And that's when I got my freedom.
Enough cannot be said about the therapeutic benefits of writing, Patricia. I swear every week we have another author who is proof of that. What a drag it is getting old, but Dr. George Holland is convinced we can make it less of a drag as long as we stay active, and he tells us how in his book entitled Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Quality Aging. Dr. Holland has a doctorate in exercise physiology, and you know what? I like the study that found exercise makes a difference no matter how old you are when you start.
There's been some very good studies with people who were 90 years of age and older, men and women. And they put them on overload weight training programs, and they did CAT scans to look at the change in their muscle mass and their bone volume, and they had significant improvements. Even some people who were on walkers and, had what we call mobility problems. So yes, you can moderate it, you can't stop it. So that's why the title of the book is Quality of Aging. The central focus that we would all like to achieve as we age is to remain independent, to be able to live in your own home. Maintaining mobility is really what it's all about. And that's dependent upon taking good care of your anatomy and your physiology. And that's really what the focus of the book is.
And I mean, George, the timing couldn't be better because we're all living longer.
Yeah. I spent a year in Japan, and I worked at the largest aging research institute in the world. As you know, they have the highest longevity. I saw some amazing things they're doing in their schools and public health programs, helping people prepare for aging as early as possible.
Where did we go wrong?
We have the highest and earliest age of onset of type 2 diabetes in the developed world. And that's because we're not getting people moving significantly early enough in life to impact on the aging process. Aging begins in the womb. It's dependent upon how healthy the mother's lifestyle is, because if she's smoking or if she's obese or she's inactive, a child will be born with changes in their DNA that will impact on their health until the day they die. So,
well, what about what they eat in Japan?
Japan has probably the healthiest diet in the developed world, too, in addition to their public health and their educational programs. They eat a lot of seafood, which is high in omega-3 fatty acids, as you know, which is an anti-cardiovascular disease factor. They eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. I ate vegetables when I lived in Japan that I'd never heard of before. Very high fiber content and low saturated fat, which you know is important in terms of heart disease and stroke, which are two of the leading killers and have been for like 60 years now. So they have good urban planning, bicycle paths, which is a major form of transportation there, especially in the suburban areas and in the rural areas. People ride bicycles everywhere. They have walking paths and parks everywhere. And this is in spite of the fact that Japan is a very high-density population. It's an island which is about the size of California, and yet they have, 350 million people that live. And I use Japan as a pretty good role model. They spent a lot of money on aging research. They're an aging population. Their birth rate is below zero now. It's a negative birth rate. And so that's why the government is, putting a lot of emphasis on helping people understand the importance of preparing for quality aging as early in life as possible. We don't do a very good job of that here.
No.
There's 10 chapters in the book, and they're about evenly divided on nutrition and what I call physical activity lifestyle. Instead of belonging to an expensive health club, I talk about incorporating a little bit of physical activity into your lifestyle every single day. We have to overcome what I call in the book the sitting disease syndrome. We spend most of our life sitting at a desk, at a computer, and we now know that sitting creates a lot of blood flow problems. The natural consequences of aging are exacerbated, and that increases your risk for things like heart attack and stroke. But you can do practical things. Get up every 10 minutes and walk around. Take your cell phone with you. But you just can't sit all day.
All right, George. So many things we can do to stay healthy, active, and independent right into our 90s. Thank you so much for doing the research. We have got to take a short break, but we're coming back and you should too. This is the Page Publishing Book Club.
Have you written a book and want to get it published? Then now's the time to call Page Publishing at 800-204-6099 and do it immediately. You see, they're looking for authors of all types of books. And unlike most publishers, Page Publishing will take the time to review most of the books submitted to them. And they'll even give you their feedback. And if they like what they read, Page Publishing will get your book into bookstores and for sale online at Amazon, the Apple iTunes Store, and other outlets. They'll handle everything: copyright protection, printing, cover art, publicity, and editing. So if you've written a novel, a children's book, a cookbook, inspirational work, a book of poetry, or biography, and want to get it published, then you need to call Page Publishing and do it immediately. Call 800-204-6099 now for your free author submission kit. Your road to fame and fortune could very well start with this simple phone call. For your free author submission kit, call Page Publishing at 800-204-6099.
We are back on the Page Publishing Book Club. I am your host, Alice Stockton Rossini. Joshua Whitley is a military kid. He moved around a lot, but was lucky enough to go to Okinawa and Japan. And the culture there inspired his creative energies and his book entitled A Moonpeckian Summer. Now, there was a book before this one entitled A Moonpeckian Spring, which wasn't published by Page. So why don't you bring us up to speed on the story, Joshua?
Most of the characters who appear in summer and a lot of the settings that appear in summer are new to the book. The main cast carries over from the first book, but a lot of their adventures and the people they meet are new. So I feel like once it gets to that point of the book, which doesn't take too long, I'd say that's about chapter 5 or so, I think that new readers will be able to adapt to the new book and not have too much of a problem.
Okay, so how's the story go?
So, I get spoilers for the end of the first book, but the main character's name is Ultreon, and his older brother Jal dies at the end of the first book. So the basic plot of the second book is Ultreon lies to other people saying that his brother is still alive, and we have to go find him. And it takes an Empire Strikes Back sort of style, where you have one group going one way and another group going the other way and saying, we'll meet here and near the end of the book. And the reason he tells this lie is because he can't fathom that his brother is actually dead, even though he saw it with his own eyes and saw that it was a pretty brutal wound. So on the surface, that's just what the book is about. We're going on this adventure. We're going to find him. We stop by some locales. We meet some people. We have, some big fight scenes. We have some character development. But on, I don't want to say like many levels deep. It's not an onion with multiple layers, but I feel like the book is really about grief. Particularly Ultreon's part of the story is about grief and losing someone and how hard that can be, and how sometimes when that happens, you don't really know how to deal with it. The best way to deal with it is to, try to go through acceptance and say, like, this is something that happened, and while it hurts, I still have to live my life, and I still have to, keep going. But it's not easy to get to that point. And you don't start off in that point. There's a reason why they say there's 5 stages of grief. And a lot of the book is Ultreon kind of going through some of these stages, some of them a lot longer than others, like the denial stage. And I think you could argue that the whole point of the book of I'm going to go on this big adventure and find him at the end is sort of the bargaining stage before ultimately trying to get to acceptance.
Is this something made up in your head, or did this somehow help you deal with a loss?
No, this was all just made up in my head.
Okay.
This was just kind of the way the story went, and yeah.
All right, good enough, Joshua. If cars are your thing, Ron London wrote the book for you, a gearhead who found love and satisfaction writing his book entitled The History of the Automobile, 1769 through 1945. Hey, Ron, what do we find out in your book that we can't find out anywhere else?
The world's first car to move under its own power, which there's a record. It was as early as 1769, and it was made in France. It was really designed by someone named Nicolas Cognat and built by this person named Michel Brezin, and the car just went 2 miles an hour, and it had to stop every 10 to 15 minutes to build up fresh steam. People who see this on the internet will find it very interesting. I found out about this in April of 2005, actually, and actually what made me interested in this in the very beginning was when I was 15 years old, there were these encyclopedias that were in my house. And I just happened to look in the encyclopedia, and I happened to see all these cars lined up in the book from 1875 to 1948. So I thought 1875 was the world's first car, but it really wasn't. So some years later, I did a poster, but it really wasn't until many years later in 2005 I found out that the world's first car was really in 1769. And the next car I have in my book is from 1775, 1786. So the cars I have in my book, it starts from 1769, it goes up to 1850, skipping years in between. In 1857, it goes year by year to 1945. And I chose the best-looking car for each year that most people say is the best-looking car. So these are cars I chose for my book. Most books have it from 1896 to the present, from 1901 to the present, or 1903 to the present. Well, my book is very unique because it starts from the world's first from 1769, which very few people know about. What I found interesting in my research also was that there was just another one made 6 years later in 1775, another one made 11 years later in 1786, 1788, 1791, and it didn't really skip that many years in between. And I found it interesting also that they started making cars really year by year, starting from as early as 1857. I have the world's first gasoline car in my book from 1863 by Jean-Joseph Net-Lunier, who was coincidentally also from France, 315 miles an hour. And
wow, hard to believe, isn't it? So you were 15 when you first laid eyes on that set of encyclopedias, and you were inspired to write a book. How long after that did you actually, get it together to write this book?
The exact date that I started doing my book was on January 2nd, 2005, and then I got done 11 years later on September 7th, 2016. It took me 11 years to do this book. It took me an extremely long time.
Oh,
11 years.
That is a long time.
Extremely long time.
Yeah.
Yes, very long time.
Well,
oh my God.
It's a lot of work.
It was a lot of work. Yeah. Finding out who made the cars, where it was made, how fast it went, the horsepower, what the cylinders were, 2 cylinders, 4 cylinders, for example. And I was writing down how long the cars were in production, a whole lot of stuff. And but finding the pictures of the cars was also difficult because, like I said, I chose the best-looking car for each year that most people say is the best-looking car. So people ask me, how do you know this is the best-looking car for each year? I told them that, from books I read, stuff I saw on the internet and stuff, pictures of the cars I saw, I agreed with these people that, these were the best-looking cars for each year.
All right, Ron, let me say this for you. You have a great name for an author, Ron London. See you on the road. Finally, Eugene Givens worked in special operations in the U.S. military for many years, and now he's written a book that uncovers and reimagines some of the most notorious U.S. military operations. The name of his book, Those in the Shadows.
It's about the special units that goes out to bring the peace to the world. Back in 1973, there was a project that the president signed into effect for anti-terrorism and peacekeeping. They would go out and take down problems of the world that had security against the United States, as in movement of nukes, terrorists that took down hostages. They would go and eliminate the problem before it got to the point where it was bad for the United States. One was the 1979, what was supposed to have done in Tehran with the hostages. A message was sent out. We've been overtaken. Within 12 hours, 3 units that were training in the area had been called upon to go in and eliminate the terrorist organization in respects to take the 79 hostages that they had taken. They were broken down into 3 parts. 1, secure the embassy. 1, securing the airport, while the other drove up 12 miles to the embassy, secure the hostages, and the other team drive back and get back into the planes and take off back up into Europe where they would be safe. What actually happened was the units, they had gotten halfway and gotten a message that the political structure said, let the hostage negotiators take charge, and they were sent back. This happened 3 times of them being called up to go into Tehran to get the hostages. And it was found out that the incoming presidential atmosphere was that they did not want the outgoing president to get all the glory. They wanted the incoming president to get the glory. So several days after he taken his oath, they automatically got released.
Are you talking about Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so I'm just trying to understand, is your book reimagining situations and how it could have been resolved? Or
This one was.
okay, let me ask you this. How many situations do you talk about in your book?
I talk about 7 incidents, one of which was this, others that the news didn't report, but I did it in the respect of covering for those who are basically still in the system.
Well, I would think you would have to do that, Eugene. Interesting stuff. And I hope the whole show's been interesting for you, our as yet or frustrated authors who long to be published. What are you waiting for? We're right here. And we will be back with another Page Publishing Book Club before you know it. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and Rob. And if you missed anything or you just feel like binge listening to the Page Publishing Book Club, all you have to do is go to 710WOR.com anytime you feel like it. Enjoy whatever you're doing for the rest of the day. We'll see you next time.